Welcome back to Galaxy Recaps. Today we'll be diving into an action thriller film titled Damaged. Enjoy the recap. After leaving Edinburgh's Central Synagogue one evening, Abigail Mears is ambushed in her home by a mysterious hooded figure. Caught off guard and unable to defend herself, Abigail meets a grim fate. Meanwhile, in Chicago, Detective Dan Lawson investigates a suspiciously staged crime scene. His sharp instincts suggest the scene was manipulated to deliver a message. However, Lawson is burdened by his past, replaying a haunting voicemail from someone named Sarah before being interrupted by new developments. He is then shown crime scene photos from Scotland, sparking his interest due to similarities with a case he handled in Chicago 6 years earlier. Intrigued, Lawson travels to Edinburgh to assist Superintendent Kessler and Detective Chief Inspector Glen Boyd. They brief him on the disturbing details of Abigail's murder, particularly the violent dismemberment and the arrangement of her limbs in the shape of a cross. While heading to Abigail's home, Boyd shares a personal tragedy. His young son passed away a year ago, and that day would have been his third birthday. At the crime scene, Boyd explains to Lawson that a key was discovered, but it doesn't match any of the locks in Abigail's house. Later, while speaking to his wife Marie on the phone about returning home for dinner, Boyd notices Avery Thompson, Abigail's neighbor across the street. Avery is a key person of interest, as several neighbors reported seeing him argue with Abigail. Boyd tries to question Avery, but the man refuses to speak without a warrant. As Boyd leaves, he speaks to another neighbor, Miss Wallen, who reveals that Avery accused Abigail of egging his car shortly before her murder. Back at the station, Boyd reports to Kessler that the investigation lacks a solid lead due to conflicting evidence. Lawson adds that he isn't certain the cases in Chicago and Edinburgh are connected. That evening, Boyd returns home but struggles with his grief, sitting in his car instead of going inside. Meanwhile, Lawson tries to contact his former partner Walker Bravo in Chicago, but only reaches his voicemail. As he drinks to drown his memories of Sarah, a hooded figure strikes again, this time targeting a young woman named Grace in the same brutal manner as Abigail. Unaware of this latest attack, Boyd picks up Lawson to revisit Abigail's home, driven by a gut feeling that they might have missed something. On their way to Abigail's house, Lawson mentions that Walker, his former partner, now resides in London, suggesting they could consult him about the case. The conversation turns personal when Lawson asks Boyd how he's coping with the loss of his son. Boyd admits that while he threw himself into work to numb the pain, his wife Marie's grief led her down a different, more difficult path. As they arrive on Abigail Street, Lawson spots Avery attempting to flee. He urges Boyd to pursue him through a back alley, where the two manage to corner Avery. When Boyd questions him about Abigail, Avery provides an alibi, claiming he was caught by a speed camera at the time of the attack. He further explains that his argument with Abigail was trivial, stemming from her work as a dog minder disturbing his peace. With no solid evidence against him, Boyd allows Avery to leave before finally heading home. The next morning, Marie suggests inviting Lawson over for dinner, but before Boyd can respond, he receives news of Grace's attack. Rushing to the scene, Boyd finds her dismembered limbs arranged in a cross, mirroring Abigail's murder. Lawson arrives shortly after and spots a partial bloodied footprint at the scene. Under UV light, they uncover a symbol resembling an H, which Lawson identifies as the Egyptian key to eternal life, the Ankh. Believing similar clues might be present at Abigail's home, Boyd proposes they investigate further. However, a cryptic text referencing the case number from Lawson's earlier investigation in Chicago shifts their focus. Reciting a verse from the text, Lawson interprets it as the culprit's view of anyone outside their religious belief as ravenous wolves to be feared. Later, Boyd speaks with Grace's mother and learns about an old friend of hers, Colin McGregor. Meanwhile, Lawson makes plans to meet with Walker. Boyd updates Kessler about the lack of progress with the mysterious key, learning that Avery's alibi has been confirmed. With no other leads, Boyd decides to follow up on Colin, who intriguingly holds a firearm license. That evening, Lawson meets Walker, who now designs alarm systems. Opening up about being haunted by thoughts of Sarah, Lawson convinces Walker to review the case files on Abigail and Grace, hoping for fresh insights. The next morning, Boyd tracks down Colin McGregor but is dismissed during questioning when Colin insists on having a lawyer present for any formal investigation. Later, Colin provides an alibi, stating he was working in the warehouse of a security firm in Manchester at the time of the murder. Kessler and Lawson observe as Boyd questions Colin, steering the conversation toward his relationship with Grace. Colin's cryptic response that Grace was a lost soul raises more suspicions. Later that evening, Kessler, Lawson, Boyd, and Walker reconvene to delve deeper into Colin's past, uncovering connections to a cult-like organization. They discuss the symbolic significance of the cross and the Ankh, theorizing that the murderer might believe they are freeing victims from their earthly lives for a greater purpose. The conversation shifts to the Chicago murders, where the culprit kept jewelry as a souvenir from each victim. It's revealed that Sarah, whose memory haunts Lawson, was one of those victims. Meanwhile, Colin secretly watches Marie from a distance as she remains alone at home. The following day at Kildalton Church, Boyd learns Colin was recently dismissed for failing to adhere to their strict beliefs. When Boyd asks if Colin could be capable of murder, he is met with evasion and is simply asked to leave. That evening, Lawson and Walker join Boyd and Marie for dinner. While the atmosphere starts off friendly, Lawson becomes uneasy noticing Walker's overly familiar behavior with Marie. This prompts him to bring up the importance of addressing grief appropriately. Marie reacts angrily, defending herself by arguing that those in deep grief cannot always act rationally. This sparks an uncomfortable yet necessary conversation between her and Boyd, leading them to a mutual understanding of each other's pain. The next morning, an optimistic Marie promises Boyd a trip to Italy once his current case is resolved. At work, Boyd and the team confirm that Colin's alibi of being in Manchester during Grace's attack holds up. However, Kessler refuses to eliminate him as a suspect, considering the possibility that Colin could have traveled to Edinburgh. Later that day, Abigail's neighbor, Miss Walsh, approaches Boyd with new information. She recalls seeing a strange man loitering near Abigail's house a few days before her murder. When shown photographs of suspects, she identifies the man as Colin. With this new evidence, Kessler and Boyd prepare a unit to apprehend Colin just as he appears ready to strike again. Spotting the police closing in, Colin attempts to flee. Guided by a drone, Boyd pursues him through the streets, ultimately capturing him and bringing him in for questioning. However, due to Colin's insistence on having a lawyer present, Kessler decides to hold him overnight, ensuring he remains in custody while they prepare their next steps. Boyd returns home that night, only to find Marie missing. Following the sound of her ringing phone up to the attic, Boyd is horrified to discover his wife has become the killer's latest victim. Devastated, he spends the night grieving until Walker visits the next morning, urging Boyd not to give up on the case. The situation worsens when Kessler informs Boyd that Marie's torso has been discovered in a local park, the first time in this series of murders that a torso has been found. Despite attempts by officers at the scene to hold him back, Boyd sees the grim sight, his overwhelming need for vengeance becoming palpable. Walker tries to calm him, but the fire in Boyd's heart is undeniable. Meanwhile, Colin's interrogation intensifies. Kessler questions him about the similarities in how the victim's limbs were arranged. When asked if he had been to America, Colin confirms he has visited several times, mentioning an encounter with a foreigner in London who spoke of an unsolved case strikingly similar to their current investigation. This catches Lawson's attention as he listens in. Boyd bursts into the interrogation room, but Kessler restrains him, preventing an emotional outburst. Lawson manages to guide Boyd out, promising to handle the questioning himself. Lawson continues the interrogation, pressing Colin about his proclaimed mission of guiding lost souls to a better place. He challenges Colin directly, asking if he is a wolf in sheep's clothing. However, without sufficient evidence to hold him, Colin is released, which infuriates Boyd. Later, Boyd meets with Lawson, adamant about staying on the case to ensure Colin faces justice. Lawson, speaking from his own painful experiences, advises Boyd to remain objective and not let his emotions cloud his judgment. He then reveals that Sarah, the victim in his Chicago case, was his girlfriend, earning Boyd's trust with his honesty. Lawson vows to find the person responsible for Marie's death. The next day at work, Lawson encourages Boyd to consider a new angle, suggesting that framing Boyd as the murderer could have been an easy way for someone, perhaps Marie's lover, to manipulate the case. That evening, they meet with Walker to revisit the details, examining everything with fresh eyes. Walker proposes that the mysterious key found at Abigail's house might fit something belonging to Colin, offering a potential lead. Later that night, a drunken Colin stumbles out of a bar only to be confronted by a stranger near his car. The encounter turns deadly as the stranger stabs Colin, leaving his fate unknown. Early the next morning, Boyd learns of Colin's disappearance and rushes to his home, determined to uncover answers with the mystery key in hand. Boyd successfully uses the key to unlock Colin's shed and immediately notifies Kessler, who instructs him to wait for backup. Despite the warning, Boyd ventures inside Colin's house, finding a bloodstain on the carpet that prompts him to return to the shed for further investigation. Inside, Boyd discovers an assortment of tools and eventually stumbles upon Colin, lifeless, mounted against the wall. Shortly after, Lawson arrives and informs Boyd that Colin's car has been recovered from a nearby lake. Together, they are led to a hidden room within Colin's house, which contains chilling evidence, detailed plans for past murders, and a list of future targets. It becomes evident that Colin genuinely believed he was helping his victims by guiding them. Boyd, however, is puzzled by the absence of any mention of Marie in Colin's plans. Lawson explains that Marie wasn't Colin's victim. Instead, her murder mirrored the Chicago homicides, indicating they were dealing with two separate killers, one being Colin, who was now dead, and the other still at large. Lawson hypothesizes that the answers lie with the foreigner Colin met in London, and suggests they investigate Colin's former security firm for leads. While browsing the security firm's website, Lawson discovers a photograph of Colin and Walker together at a convention in London. Just then, Walker calls and Lawson informs him of Colin's death. After confirming Walker's visit, Lawson discreetly sends Boyd the photograph and reveals his suspicion that Walker is the foreigner Colin encountered. Boyd, alarmed, heads to Lawson's hotel, calling Kessler en route to warn her of the potential danger. At the hotel, Walker arrives to find Lawson's laptop displaying the photograph of him with Colin. Attempting to defend himself, Walker claims he works with many security firms and doesn't recall meeting Colin. Boyd, still driving to the scene, calls Lawson to warn him, prompting Lawson to silently arm himself. Facing Walker, Lawson displays jewelry from the Chicago case and accuses him of gifting the necklace to Sarah, revealing that Sarah had been his girlfriend. Lawson confesses his jealousy over Sarah's affair with Walker, admitting he disposed of her torso to avoid being implicated in her murder. He further reveals that he hadn't intentionally arranged the cross-formation of limbs, it simply happened by chance. Accepting responsibility for his crimes, Lawson shockingly admits that the other four victims were not random. He explains their connection to Sarah and Walker. One was a receptionist at the hotel where Walker stayed with Sarah, another a clerk at the jewelry store where Walker purchased the necklace. A third was the florist who sold Walker flowers for Sarah, and the fourth was the waiter from the restaurant where Walker and Sarah dined together. This revelation leaves Walker grief-stricken and horrified as Lawson lays bare his twisted motives, his actions rooted in a deeply personal vendetta. Coming to terms with the shocking truth, Walker admits he has lived with guilt for failing to deliver justice for Sarah. In a moment of rage, he lunges at Lawson, but Lawson shoots him in self-defense. When Boyd finally arrives, still under the impression that Walker is the killer, Lawson manipulates him, urging Boyd to finish Walker off in the name of justice for Sarah and Marie. Boyd keeps his gun trained on Walker, hesitating, as Walker's final confession of love for Sarah draws Boyd's attention just before he takes his last breath. After calling for medical assistance, Boyd notices the jewelry souvenirs among Lawson's belongings. His suspicion grows as he examines Lawson's personal effects and discovers fake passports and a planned trip to Ireland. Realizing the truth, Boyd immediately leaves the hotel to pursue Lawson, reporting the situation to Kessler along the way. The high-speed chase takes them onto a highway and eventually down smaller roads leading into a forest. Boyd continues the pursuit, even as Lawson shoots at his car, causing him to lose consciousness temporarily. Awakening to the eerie sound of Lawson whistling in the woods, Boyd follows the sound, confronting Lawson about Marie's murder. Lawson coldly responds, claiming his actions freed Boyd, as there was no forgiveness for Marie's infidelity. Confident in his ability to evade capture, Lawson asserts that no one has stopped him in 6 years, and that nothing will prevent him from continuing his path. He disarms Boyd, destroys his phone to prevent him from calling for help, and leaves the scene. Despite being shaken, Boyd vows to track Lawson down in Ireland. The next day, Boyd orchestrates a customs check at the ferry port in an effort to apprehend Lawson. However, it turns out the passenger matching Lawson's name is someone else entirely. Enraged, Boyd learns from Kessler that the case has now been handed over to Interpol, stripping him of jurisdiction. Still, Boyd remains resolute, determined to personally bring Lawson to justice for Marie's murder. Elsewhere, Lawson is seen savoring a drink in peace, driving away into the sunset as free as ever. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one.